He was a programmer nobody noticed. He ate lunch alone at his desk, illuminated by the pale glow of a monochrome monitor. He had no friends. He lived in a studio apartment in Las Vegas that smelled like old coffee and stale air, the kind of place where curtains stayed drawn because sunlight felt like an accusation. He was 28 years old and had never been kissed. And then, in 18 months, he won the Nevada State Lottery 7 times. Not unusual numbers. Not suspiciously close together. 7 perfectly spaced, mathematically impossible wins totaling $2.8 million. The odds of this happening by chance are 1 in 4 billion. 1 in 4 billion. Statisticians who analyzed the pattern afterward would describe it as mathematically impossible under normal circumstances. But here's what's fascinating about this story. He didn't do it to become rich. He did it to prove he was smarter than everyone else. And then he walked into the Nevada Gaming Commission with printouts of his own code, sat down across from investigators, and turned himself in before they even knew his name. This is not a story about a criminal mastermind. It's a story about what happens when someone brilliant enough to see a flaw in reality is too psychologically fragmented to live with exploiting it. It's about the moment when genius becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction. And it asks a question that should make you deeply uncomfortable. If you could do something no one would ever discover, would you? And if you did, could you live with yourself? This is Velvet Traps. To understand how someone becomes capable of hacking a state lottery system, you have to understand what it feels like to be invisible while simultaneously feeling like you see everything. His childhood was the story of a boy who learned, very early, that being smart was not the same as being wanted. He was the kind of child who could do calculus in 6th grade but couldn't figure out how to talk to other children. His parents were proud of his test scores. They were also bewildered by him. They didn't know what to do with a son who preferred computers to birthday parties, who spent his 12th birthday alone in his room writing code instead of inviting friends over. There were no friends to invite. School was systematic humiliation disguised as education. He was the kid who raised his hand too much, the kid who corrected the teacher, the kid who ate lunch in the computer lab because the cafeteria was a social minefield he couldn't navigate. By high school, he'd developed a protective shell. If people thought he was strange, he would be intentionally strange. He'd wear the same shirt 3 days in a row. He'd make eye contact too long, or not at all. He'd laugh at jokes only he understood. The rejection became a choice rather than something that happened to him. This is how intelligent people survive unbearable isolation. They convince themselves that other people simply aren't worth understanding. He went to college and discovered something that changed everything. Computers didn't judge him. Code was logical. It followed rules. It responded to brilliance with precision. You could spend 16 hours writing a program, and it would work exactly as intended. And that consistency was the closest thing to love he'd ever experienced. He was good at this. Genuinely, undeniably good. His professors noticed. They told him he had a gift. For the first time in his life, his intelligence wasn't a liability. It was valuable. But college ended, and he entered the working world, and something happened that his teachers hadn't warned him about. The world didn't actually want his gifts. It wanted him to work within constraints, to follow procedures, to not see the flaws in systems that other people had built and accepted. He got a job at a gaming company in Las Vegas in 1981. Right as Nevada was transitioning from mechanical slot machines to computerized lottery systems. He was hired to help build the systems that would determine who won millions of dollars. And from his first day, he saw something that made him feel, for the first time since childhood, like he understood something that mattered. The system had a flaw, a major flaw, a flaw so obvious to someone with his training that he couldn't understand why everyone else couldn't see it. And no one had told him not to look for flaws. No one had explicitly said, "Don't find vulnerabilities in the lottery system." The rules of his employment said he was supposed to help secure the system, but the rules didn't say he couldn't see the ways it could be exploited. And once you see something like that, it's impossible to unsee. He started keeping notes, just observations, just the mathematical patterns that would let someone, in theory, predict outcomes. He wasn't planning anything yet. He was just noticing, just documenting. Just proving to himself that he understood something that the designers of the system hadn't accounted for. This is what intelligent people do when they're isolated. They build private worlds of understanding. Worlds where they're the only one who sees clearly. Worlds where finally their genius matters. The flaw wasn't in the random number generator itself. It was in how the system seeded the generator. It was in the timing protocols. It was in the assumption that no one would be both smart enough and motivated enough to exploit the mathematical vulnerabilities. The company had hired brilliant people to build the system, but they'd hired them to build something that seemed random, not something that actually was random. And there's a difference. There's always a difference between appearance and reality. And he could see that difference. His life outside of work remained exactly as empty as it had always been. He still ate lunch alone. He still lived in that studio apartment. He still had no one to talk to about what he'd discovered. But inside his head, something had shifted. For the first time, he had a secret that mattered, a secret that proved he was smarter than the people around him, a secret that if he ever decided to use it would make him matter in a way that nothing else ever could. He wasn't planning to use it. Not yet. Not consciously. But he was starting to think about what it would feel like if he did. He was starting to imagine a life where his intelligence wasn't invisible anymore. A life where, for once, he would be the one who understood the rules better than everyone else. A life where genius finally meant something. The Nevada state lottery system in 1982 was state-of-the-art. It was also fragile in ways that only someone inside the system could recognize. He spent 3 months just observing. 3 months of going to work, doing his job, maintaining the facade of a competent but unremarkable programmer. 3 months of watching other people interact with the system, watching them trust it, watching them assume that randomness was truly random. And during those 3 months, he built a complete map of the vulnerability in his mind. The vulnerability wasn't a single flaw. It was a constellation of small decisions that, when combined, created an exploitable pattern. The system used a pseudo-random number generator that was seeded based on the time of day, not just the hour or minute, the exact second. But the precision of the clock wasn't perfect. There was a window, a very small window, where the seed values would repeat with mathematical regularity. If you knew exactly when that window was, and if you understood the mathematical relationship between the seed and the output, you could predict, with near certainty, what numbers would be drawn. He wrote the code. He did it in isolation, on his personal computer at home, never at work. He was careful. He was methodical. He documented nothing except in his own mind. And when he had the algorithm working, when he could sit at his home computer and predict lottery numbers with accuracy that should have been impossible, he experienced something close to euphoria. This is what intelligent people who've been invisible their entire lives feel when they finally have proof. Validation. Not happiness. Validation. The feeling that they were right all along, that their superiority was real, that the people who dismissed them, who excluded them, who never called them back after job interviews, those people were simply less intelligent than they were, and now they had mathematical proof. But having the algorithm and using it were two different things. He understood that immediately. Using it meant exposure. Using it meant that eventually someone would notice the pattern. Using it meant risk, so he didn't use it. Not at first, he just knew he could. He just walked around Las Vegas knowing that he had the power to take millions of dollars from the lottery system, and no one even knew who he was. No one even suspected. The question that consumed him, though, was deeper than the technical question of whether he could do it. It was the psychological question. If he did do it, would it finally make him matter? He was living in a state of intellectual dissociation. At work, he was a programmer. At home, he was a man who understood something that could revolutionize gaming security, or destroy it, depending on perspective. In social situations, he was invisible, but in his own mind, he was a genius, a genuine, undeniable genius. And geniuses don't go unrecognized forever. They can't. It's not how the world works. He started to fantasize about what would happen if he used the algorithm. Not fantasize in a planning sense. He wasn't making detailed plans yet, but fantasize in the way that lonely people do, constructing narratives where suddenly their life mattered. He imagined the investigation. He imagined the confusion on the investigators' faces when they realized what had happened. He imagined being recognized finally as someone too intelligent to be dismissed. The other thing he was starting to recognize, though he wouldn't have articulated it this way, was that he was desperate for connection. He was desperate for someone to understand him, and the only person who ever had understood him was himself. So in some deep, unexamined part of his psychology, he was drawn to the idea of a confrontation where his intelligence would finally force someone to see him, where someone would have to acknowledge that he was worth paying attention to. His first lottery ticket was purchased on a Tuesday in March 1982. He was careful. He didn't buy it at the gaming company. He drove to a different part of Las Vegas. He filled out the ticket with numbers that his algorithm had predicted would be drawn 3 days later. His hands shook slightly as he handed the money to the clerk. This was the moment where theory became action. This was the moment where the invisible programmer became someone with agency. He watched the drawing on television alone in his apartment. He watched the numbers appear one by one, and they matched. All of them. He'd won $127,000. He didn't feel the way he thought he would feel. He didn't feel happy. He felt terrified. He felt like he'd just done something that couldn't be undone. He felt like he'd crossed a line that had seemed abstract, until the moment he actually crossed it. He'd stolen from the lottery. He'd exploited a system. He'd broken the law, and now he had to live with that. But he also felt something else. He felt like he finally existed. The lottery commission would eventually investigate that ticket. They would see that someone had won, and somewhere in the investigation, there would be a moment where someone realized that winning was statistically impossible, and that moment would force someone to take him seriously. That moment would make him real. He cashed the ticket. He was careful about it. He took it to a different part of the state, to a different lottery office. He filled out the paperwork. He received the check. And then he sat in his apartment with $127,000 in his bank account and felt completely, utterly alone. The money didn't change his life. He didn't buy anything. He didn't move to a better apartment. He didn't use it to become someone else. He kept it. He sat with it. And he thought about the next ticket. Over the next 18 months, he purchased 7 lottery tickets. Each one was calculated. Each one used the algorithm to predict numbers with impossible accuracy. Each ticket won. The amounts ranged from $89,000 to $487,000. The total, across all 7 wins, was $247,332. The psychological profile of someone committing a crime, while simultaneously wanting to be caught, is complex. He wasn't purchasing these tickets because he needed money. He had enough money after the first ticket to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He was purchasing them because each ticket was a message. Each win was a statement. I am smarter than your system. I see what you don't see. I understand the mathematics of randomness better than the people who designed this. But there was another layer to it, one that he was barely conscious of. Each ticket, each win was also a confession. He was leaving a trail. He was making sure that eventually, someone would have to notice. Because if no one noticed, then what did it matter? If he could exploit the system perfectly and no one ever knew, then he was still invisible. The crime would be meaningless if it went undetected. The only thing that would make him real, finally, was if someone recognized what he'd done. So he was careful, but not careful enough. He bought the tickets at different locations, but not so different that there wasn't a pattern. The timing between wins was irregular, but not random. A statistical analyst, if she was good enough, would see it. And there were good analysts. There had to be. During those 18 months, his life remained externally unchanged. He still went to work. He still did his job competently. He still ate lunch alone. He still lived in that studio apartment. But internally, he was living in a state of mounting tension. He was waiting for the confrontation. He was waiting for the moment when his intelligence would finally be undeniable. The money accumulated in his bank account. He didn't spend it. He didn't invest it. He didn't even move it to a different bank to hide it. It was just there. $7 million of evidence that he'd done something impossible. And he left it sitting in his checking account like a confession waiting to happen. His coworkers didn't know. His family didn't know. No one in his life knew that he'd fundamentally altered his relationship to reality. He was living 2 completely separate lives. The life of an invisible programmer and the life of a genius who had defeated a state system. And the cognitive dissonance of that split was starting to fracture something inside him. He began making mistakes. Small mistakes, but mistakes. He referenced the lottery algorithm in a comment in his work code. He didn't think anyone would see it, but he left it there. He started talking more at work, inserting subtle comments about how flawed the lottery security was. He was unconsciously broadcasting. He was leaving breadcrumbs. He was making sure that when someone finally investigated, they would be able to trace the path back to him. The psychological term for this is passive confession. It's what people do when they want to be caught, but can't consciously admit that they want to be caught. They leave clues. They become sloppy. They create a situation where discovery becomes inevitable, and then they tell themselves it was bad luck, or carelessness, or coincidence. But it's not. It's intentional. It's a way of forcing yourself to face consequences without having to actively choose to face them. His internal experience during this time was one of escalating desperation. The wins were supposed to make him feel powerful. Instead, they made him feel more isolated than ever. Because now he had this secret that was even bigger, even more separating him from normal human experience. He couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't share it. He was entirely alone with it. He started to think about what would happen if he got caught, and he realized with a clarity that was almost shocking that being caught would be a relief. Being caught would mean that finally, someone would have to acknowledge who he was. Someone would have to recognize his intelligence. Someone would have to take him seriously. It would mean prison, probably. It would mean consequences. But it would mean existing. It would mean mattering. The 6-month mark came and went. The 12-month mark. 18 months. The statistical probability of his wins going undetected was decreasing with every ticket. The pattern was becoming more and more visible to anyone who was looking for it. And someone was looking. A lottery analyst named Margaret Chin was reviewing statistical anomalies in the Nevada lottery system. It was her job to identify patterns that suggested fraud, system failure, or impossibility. She was thorough. She was intelligent. And in March 1984, she noticed something that shouldn't have existed, a probability pattern. 7 wins over 18 months that, when analyzed together, had odds of 1 in 4 billion. She flagged it. She brought it to her supervisor. They launched an investigation. The programmer was sitting at his desk when the investigators arrived. He was not surprised. Some part of him had been waiting for this moment since he'd purchased the first ticket. Some part of him had orchestrated this entire sequence of events to arrive at this exact moment, the moment where he would finally be forced to exist in someone else's awareness. They asked him questions. They showed him data. They asked if he knew anything about the lottery system's vulnerabilities. And instead of denying everything, instead of hiding, he did something that shocked them. He went home. He printed out all of his code. He printed out his documentation of the algorithm. He printed out his notes on exactly how the system could be exploited. And the next day, he walked back into the Nevada Gaming Commission, sat down across from the investigators, and handed them a stack of papers that constituted a complete confession. The confession happened on a Thursday afternoon in March 1984. The investigators expected him to be defensive, strategic, evasive. Instead, he was almost relieved. He was calm. He was articulate. He explained exactly how the flaw existed, exactly how he'd exploited it, and exactly why he'd done it. When they asked him why, he didn't have a simple answer. He told them about noticing the flaw, about understanding the mathematics, about realizing that the system was vulnerable in ways the designers hadn't anticipated. He told them about the algorithm, but when they asked why he'd actually used it, why he'd actually purchased the tickets, he struggled to articulate it. How do you explain to someone else that you did something illegal because you needed to prove to yourself that you were real? What he said was, I needed to know if I was right. I needed proof that I could see something that no one else could see. What he meant was, I needed to matter. I needed someone to notice me. I needed to exist. The investigators struggled with his psychology. They were used to criminals who were motivated by greed, by desperation, by malice. They understood people who committed crimes because they had to, or because they wanted something. But this man had wanted nothing except to be recognized as intelligent. He hadn't spent the money. He hadn't tried to hide. He'd left a trail that was almost deliberately visible. He'd constructed a situation where discovery was inevitable. And when discovery came, he'd confessed immediately. The question that hung in the air unspoken was, had he wanted to be caught all along? The answer, psychologically, was yes. But it was a more complicated yes than that. He hadn't consciously decided to commit fraud in order to get caught. But he had unconsciously constructed a situation where getting caught was the only possible outcome that would give his actions meaning. Because if no one ever found out, if his exploitation of the system went undetected, then he was still invisible. The crime would be a private victory, and a private victory isn't a victory at all when your entire psychology is built on the need to be seen. The investigation that followed was thorough. They brought in computer security experts. They brought in mathematicians. They examined the algorithm. They verified that his exploitation was exactly as comprehensive as he'd claimed. And what they discovered was deeply disturbing to the gaming industry. The system had a fundamental vulnerability. A single person, if they were intelligent enough and motivated enough, could have complete control over lottery outcomes. The implications were massive. Every win he'd predicted was mathematically impossible under normal circumstances. Every ticket should have been flagged. The system had failed completely, and the reason it had failed was precisely what he'd understood. The designers had built a system that appeared random without actually being random. They'd made assumptions about how secure their randomness was, and those assumptions were wrong. For the gaming industry, this was a catastrophe. For the programmer, this was vindication. His intelligence had been real. His understanding had been accurate. The system had been as flawed as he'd seen it, and now the entire world was going to know that he'd been right all along. But the cost of that vindication was significant. The gaming industry faced a complete overhaul of its computerized lottery systems. Nevada had to implement new security protocols. The public lost faith in lottery integrity. Thousands of people who'd played tickets fairly suddenly had to confront the reality that the system they'd trusted was fundamentally compromised. The programmer's private understanding had become public knowledge. His private victory had become public scandal. And he was going to prison. The guilt he experienced was not guilt about stealing from the lottery system. It was guilt about forcing this exposure on everyone else. He'd wanted to be seen, but he hadn't fully considered what being seen would cost. He'd wanted recognition for his intelligence, but the cost of that recognition was that his intelligence had to be positioned as a threat. In the weeks between his confession and his trial, he experienced something close to a psychological collapse. He'd gotten what he wanted. He was no longer invisible. Everyone knew who he was now. The media had picked up the story. He was the genius programmer who'd hacked the Nevada lottery. He was famous. He was recognized. He mattered, and he was profoundly, utterly depressed. Because recognition obtained through crime isn't the same as connection. Being famous isn't the same as being loved. Being seen as a threat isn't the same as being understood. During the trial preparation, a court-appointed psychologist interviewed him. The psychologist later wrote in her report, "The defendant does not exhibit the psychological profile of a typical criminal. He shows no signs of sociopathy, no evidence of genuine malice, and significant evidence of self-directed anger and guilt. His crime appears to have been motivated by a need for recognition rather than a desire for financial gain. The defendant seems to have unconsciously constructed a situation where discovery and punishment were inevitable. This suggests underlying suicidal ideation masked as criminal behavior." She was right. The programmer had been in some deep and unacknowledged way trying to destroy himself. He'd been trying to create a situation where the emptiness of his life would become impossible to ignore. And he'd succeeded. He'd made his invisibility so painful that the only escape was exposure. The legal process that followed was, in many ways, more psychologically devastating than the crime itself. He entered the courtroom knowing that he was going to be convicted. There was no question of guilt or innocence. He had confessed. The evidence was undeniable. The question was simply how long he would be imprisoned. The question was how the system would respond to his intelligence being weaponized against itself. But before the conviction came, the media circus. And the media circus revealed something about public psychology that was almost as disturbing as his crime. People were fascinated. They wanted to understand how someone could do this. They wanted to know what made him tick. They wanted to understand the mind of a genius. And in wanting to understand him, they assigned him characteristics he didn't actually have. The media portrayed him as a master criminal, a criminal prodigy, a man who'd engineered the perfect crime and been brought down by overconfidence. The narrative was compelling. It was understandable. It was also completely wrong. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a lonely man who'd tried to matter and had accidentally started a national scandal. But he didn't correct the narrative. In some ways, he preferred the false version to the true version. The false version made his crime mean something. The false version positioned him as powerful rather than broken. The false version was less humiliating than the truth, that he'd done this because he was desperate to be noticed, that he'd destroyed a state system not because he was brilliant, but because he was desperate. The trial lasted 3 weeks. He was convicted on all counts. The sentencing hearing came on a Tuesday in September 1984. The judge, in his statement, expressed a kind of bewilderment about the defendant's psychology. The judge understood crime motivated by greed, crime motivated by addiction, crime motivated by desperation, but crime motivated by the need to be seen, that was something else entirely. That suggested a psychological disorder that the legal system didn't have adequate language for. The programmer received 8 years in federal prison. It was a significant sentence. but not as severe as some anticipated. The judge seemed to understand that this man was not a threat in the traditional sense. He was not going to victimize people. He was not going to commit violent crime. He was simply someone whose psychology had fractured under the weight of invisibility. In the months before he entered prison, he had time to reflect. And what he reflected on was the simple, devastating fact that he'd destroyed everything to gain the recognition that he'd thought would make him whole. And now he had that recognition, and he was still hollow. He was still empty. The validation hadn't filled anything. The fame hadn't connected him to anyone. He was still fundamentally alone. His mother visited him once before his sentencing. She was a woman who'd never understood her son. She'd been proud of his intelligence and utterly bewildered by his emotional distance. She sat across from him in a visiting room and asked a simple question. Why did you do it? He tried to explain about the flaw in the system. He tried to explain about the mathematics. He tried to explain about wanting to prove something. But what came out was simpler and more honest than he'd been with anyone else. I needed someone to notice me. I needed to matter. His mother cried, not because she was shocked by his admission, but because she realized too late what her distance had cost. She'd raised a child who was brilliant enough to hack a state lottery system, but too broken to reach out for help. She'd raised a son who'd chosen exposure and prison over continuing to live invisibly. She visited him a few more times after that. Their conversations were quieter. They started to develop a connection that had never existed before. It took his imprisonment. It took his public humiliation. It took his fall from invisible genius to convicted criminal for them to actually talk to each other. The irony wasn't lost on him. The weight of knowing what no one else knew, that had been the burden that drove him to confession. The weight of being intelligent in a world that didn't want him, that couldn't see him, that couldn't understand him. The weight of that had become unbearable. And confession, paradoxically, had been the only way to put it down. But putting it down meant admitting that intelligence without connection is just another form of isolation. It meant accepting that being right isn't the same as being loved. It meant facing the reality that he'd sacrificed a normal life, a future, his freedom, all to be noticed. And in the noticing, he'd become a cautionary tale rather than a genius. There was a moment approximately 2 weeks before his confession, where everything could have gone differently. He was sitting in his apartment. It was late evening. He had just won his 7th lottery ticket. The amount was $487,000. His total haul was now nearly $3 million. He was financially secure beyond the dreams of most people. He was intelligent enough to cover his tracks. The statistical investigation was months away. If he'd simply stopped, if he'd simply closed the algorithm and destroyed the code, if he'd simply lived his life quietly with his $3 million, he probably would never have been caught. This is the critical moment. This is the decision point where his narrative could have pivoted completely. He sat with his laptop and the code in front of him. He looked at the algorithm that had given him everything he'd wanted. Recognition, validation, proof of his superiority. He had the power to delete it. He had the power to walk away. He had the power to live a life where he was rich but invisible. And he realized, in that moment, that he couldn't do it. The reason he couldn't do it wasn't that he wanted more money. It was that he needed the narrative to reach its conclusion. Some part of him knew that his intelligent crime would eventually be discovered. Some part of him needed it to be discovered. Because discovery meant that finally, someone would have to see him. Someone would have to acknowledge that he existed. Someone would have to recognize that he was intelligent enough to do something impossible. The alternative, walking away, staying rich, remaining invisible, was psychologically unbearable. It would mean winning and not mattering. It would mean succeeding in a way that no one would ever know about. It would mean that his intelligence had proven itself to him but to no one else. And for someone whose entire psychology was built on the need for external validation, internal knowledge wasn't enough. So he made the choice, consciously and deliberately, to stay on the course that would lead to his capture. He made the choice to keep the code intact. He made the choice to not destroy the evidence. He made the choice to leave breadcrumbs that would lead investigators back to him. This is what makes his crime psychologically distinct from most other crimes. He didn't want to get away with it. He wanted to be caught, and he engineered his own capture with the same precision that he'd engineered the exploitation of the lottery system. The question that lingered in that moment was not, will I get caught? It was, am I brave enough to face the consequences of existing? Because that's what it was really about. It was about the existential terror of being invisible. It was about the psychological desperation of someone whose entire sense of self was built on being smarter than everyone else. And it was about the realization that if no one ever acknowledged that superiority, then it didn't matter. Intelligence without witnesses isn't intelligence. It's just private delusion. He could have been a ghost. He could have been the invisible genius who perfectly exploited a state system and lived off the proceeds in complete anonymity. But that would have been a kind of death. That would have been the ultimate invisibility. So instead, he chose exposure. He chose consequences. He chose a future where he would be known, even if he was known as a criminal. The psychologist who later interviewed him asked, "Did you want to be caught?" He answered, "I needed to be caught. I needed someone to have to notice me. I couldn't keep that secret forever. The secret was killing me." This is the psychological paradox at the heart of his story. He committed the crime in order to be discovered. He exploited the system in order to be exposed. He proved his genius in order to be punished. And in doing that, he transformed himself from an invisible man into someone the world would never forget. It was not redemption. It was not triumph. It was self-destruction dressed up in the language of intelligence. It was the ultimate expression of someone so desperate to matter that he was willing to sacrifice everything to be seen. The actual moment of confession was surprisingly ordinary. There were no dramatic revelations. There was no moment where he broke down or showed profound emotion. He simply walked into the Nevada Gaming Commission with a folder of papers, sat down across from two investigators who didn't know his name, and said, "I want to tell you about the lottery system vulnerability." For the next 6 hours, he explained the flaw. He explained the code. He explained how he'd predicted the numbers. He explained the algorithm with perfect clarity. He answered every question directly. He offered no excuses. He took complete responsibility. And as he spoke, the investigators began to understand that this wasn't a man trying to avoid consequences. This was a man who was trying to construct a narrative where consequences were inevitable. By the end of the interview, one of the investigators said, "You planned to be caught, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. He said, "I knew someone would eventually notice the pattern. I knew it was mathematically impossible for it to go undetected. I think I wanted it to be noticed." The confession became public immediately. The media descended. The state launched its full investigation. The gaming industry went into crisis mode. And through it all, he remained calm. He was finally getting what he'd wanted for his entire life: attention, recognition, the forced acknowledgement that he existed and that he mattered. His family's experience of his confession was devastation. His mother had to face the reality that her distant, brilliant son had committed a federal crime. His father, who had been barely present in his life, suddenly had to reckon with the fact that his son's genius had been a sign of sickness rather than superiority. His few remaining relatives had to explain to their communities why their family member was now a criminal. The victim of his crime, the Nevada lottery system, and by extension, the people who'd played it fairly, experienced violation. The lottery had been a system they'd trusted. It had represented the possibility of sudden luck, sudden change, sudden transformation. And now that system had been revealed as vulnerable to manipulation. The public trust in computerized gaming had been shattered. For the people who played the lottery legitimately, there was a particular kind of betrayal in learning that the system could be compromised by a single person. Every ticket they'd purchased, every hope they'd invested in winning, had been based on the assumption that the odds were fair. And now they had to confront the reality that someone inside the system had violated that trust. The programmer experienced his consequences with a kind of resigned acceptance. He'd wanted to be caught. He'd wanted to be exposed. Now he was exposed, and he had to live with the reality of what that meant. He was no longer invisible. He was infamous. He was the programmer who'd hacked the lottery. He was the genius who'd proven that computerized gaming systems could be compromised. He was the man who'd needed recognition so desperately that he'd destroyed a state system to get it. In his final statement before sentencing, he addressed the court with surprising honesty. "I know what I did was wrong. I know I violated the trust that people had in this system, and I know that I did it because I needed someone to notice that I existed. I was invisible for my entire life, and that invisibility became unbearable. So I did something that forced people to notice me. I got what I wanted, and now I'm going to prison for it. That's the trade I made, and I accept it." The judge, in response, spoke about the complicated nature of intelligence without wisdom, about the danger of brilliant minds without ethical grounding, about the tragedy of someone so desperate for recognition that they were willing to destroy trust to achieve it. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. He entered prison in December 1984. He was 28 years old. He had committed one crime. He would never commit another. He would eventually become a model prisoner, helpful, cooperative, intellectually engaged. He would teach computer programming to other inmates. He would develop a genuine connection with some of them, and he would learn, finally, what his years outside prison had never taught him, that mattering to other people doesn't require being superior to them, that being seen doesn't require proving your brilliance at the expense of others, that connection is possible without validation, that you can matter simply by showing up, by being honest, by treating other people with respect. The irony, of course, is that the thing he'd wanted so desperately, to be noticed, to matter, to be recognized as intelligent, became possible only after he'd lost everything, only after he'd been stripped of his freedom, his future, his independence, only after he'd been forced to exist in a community where he couldn't hide behind his intellect. Only then did he begin to understand what he'd actually been searching for. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't superiority. It wasn't proof of genius. It was connection. And connection, as it turned out, couldn't be achieved through crime. It could only be achieved through vulnerability, through admitting that you needed other people, through accepting that intelligence without humility is just another form of isolation. This is the story of someone brilliant enough to see a flaw that no one else could see, and broken enough to exploit it in order to be noticed. It's a story about what happens when intelligence becomes isolated from community, and it's a story that forces us to confront something uncomfortable about ourselves, the fragility of systems we trust and the fragility of people we overlook. The lottery system that he exploited was rebuilt. It's now more secure. The vulnerability he identified has been closed, but the damage, the loss of public trust, the revelation that computerized security has limits, that damage persists. Thousands of people stopped playing the lottery after his confession. They stopped because they realized that the system wasn't as fair as they'd believed, and they were right. The system wasn't fair. It was vulnerable to exploitation by a single intelligent person. That knowledge changed the way people thought about luck, about probability, about the systems we build to distribute chance. But there's another side to this story that deserves examination. We live in a world that doesn't know what to do with people who are intellectually exceptional, but socially fractured. We celebrate genius. We reward intelligence. We build systems around the assumption that smart people will automatically succeed. But we don't build systems to help smart people connect. We don't teach brilliant people how to exist in community. We don't acknowledge that intelligence without connection is just another form of suffering. The programmer was smart enough to hack a state lottery system, but he wasn't smart enough to solve the problem that actually haunted him, the problem of being seen, being loved, being connected. Those things require a different kind of intelligence. They require emotional intelligence, social intelligence, the intelligence to understand that other people matter as much as you do, the intelligence to recognize that superiority is just another form of isolation. And we, as a society, don't teach that. We celebrate people who are smarter than everyone else. We reward them with opportunities and status. But we don't teach them how to be human with other people who are less intelligent than they are. We don't teach them that intelligence is a gift that's only meaningful if you can use it to help other people understand something true about themselves or the world. The psychological question that should haunt us is this: how many brilliant people are we destroying by celebrating their intelligence while ignoring their need for connection? How many geniuses are we creating who are so isolated that they eventually commit acts of self-destruction simply to be noticed? How many people are living invisible lives, feeling so disconnected from the world that they're willing to destroy systems just to prove they exist? The programmer's story is not ultimately about crime. It's not about the lottery system or the money or the technical vulnerability. It's about what we do to people when we celebrate their minds but ignore their hearts. It's about what happens when someone is so desperate to matter that they're willing to sacrifice everything to be seen. And it's about whether we, as a society, recognize the cost of that desperation before it's too late. He would serve 7 years of his 8-year sentence. He would be released in 1991. He would find work in a different field, one that didn't require him to be invisible. He would never be famous again. He would never commit another crime. He would build, slowly and deliberately, a life that was quiet, small, but real. A life where he mattered not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he showed up, because he was honest, because he learned how to need people. This is what redemption looks like. Not the erasure of what you did, but the acceptance of it. Not the return to invisibility, but the choice to be visible in a way that doesn't require destroying everything else. Not the reclamation of genius, but the surrender to the possibility of being human. The question that remains, the question that should make you uncomfortable is this: could this happen to you? Could you, if you were intelligent enough and desperate enough, look at a system and see only its flaws? Could you exploit it? Could you convince yourself that you were simply revealing truth rather than committing crime? Could you get so isolated, so invisible, so desperate to matter, that you would be willing to destroy the trust that other people had in order to be seen? The uncomfortable answer is, yes, you could. Any of us could. Because the line between genius and destruction, between intelligence and isolation, between seeing what's wrong and acting on that knowledge, that line is thinner than we want to admit. This story explores that line, and it asks you to consider, what separates you from him? What would make you invisible? What would it take for you to do something you believed was impossible? And most importantly, what does it mean that someone brilliant enough to do this was too broken to ask for help? If you've experienced a moment where you felt invisible, where you felt like your intelligence wasn't enough to make you matter, where you felt so isolated that you considered doing something you knew was wrong just to be noticed, share your story at velvettraps@sagmail.com. Your experience matters. Your perspective helps us understand ourselves and each other. And every submission is read. Thank you for exploring this with us. Velvet Traps exists to understand deception, not to celebrate it, but to examine what it reveals about us. What we learned from this story is that sometimes the most dangerous deceptions aren't the ones people commit against each other. They're the ones we commit against ourselves. The story we tell ourselves about why we're invisible, the narrative we construct about why we don't matter. The lie we live when we tell ourselves that no one would notice if we disappeared. That's not true. You matter. And the saddest thing about this story is that if someone had told him that, if someone had reached out, if someone had recognized his intelligence and his need for connection at the same time, none of this would have happened. He would have just been a brilliant person, not a brilliant person who needed to destroy everything to be seen. That's the tragedy at the heart of his story. Not the crime, not the prison sentence, but the fact that he needed recognition so desperately that he was willing to sacrifice his life to get it, when what he actually needed was connection. And that's a need that none of us should ever have to destroy ourselves to fulfill.